50 days. That is how long Nancy Guthrie has been missing. 50 days since an 84-year-old woman vanished from her home in one of the most peaceful neighborhoods in Tucson, Arizona. No ransom call ever came. No body has been found. Not one suspect has been arrested. The FBI is in the field. The Pima County Sheriff Department is active. National media from every major network in this country has not looked away. And still, here we are. Day 50. No answers. But here is what most people following this case do not know yet. The man who took her made a mistake. It is not a dramatic mistake. It is not something you would notice if you were watching casually. It is less than an inch of exposed skin between the bottom of a sleeve and the top of a tactical glove. That is all. A strip of skin smaller than a matchbook. And on that strip of skin, federal investigators believe, there is a tattoo. A specific tattoo. One that is being cross-referenced against federal criminal databases right now, in real time, as you watch this. There is more. The FBI has changed the central question driving this entire investigation. For weeks, the question was, where did this crime happen? Now the question is something far more precise. Now they are asking, where did this plan begin? And the answer does not start in February when Nancy disappeared. It does not start in January when investigators believe the suspect was already standing at her front door. It starts 3 months earlier, in October, on an ordinary Friday afternoon, in a restaurant, at a table where two women sat and talked about what makes a city feel like home, while someone nearby watched one of them in a way that was anything but ordinary. We are also going to go through a family statement that most people read too quickly. On the surface, it looks like a plea to the public. Read it carefully, word by word, and there is something inside it the Guthrie family has never said before. Something quiet and devastating that tells you exactly where this family believes this case is heading. Stay with me. This is the most complete picture of what is happening right now in the Nancy Guthrie investigation. Before we go any further, if you have been following this case and you want every update the moment it drops, subscribe to Notebook Vine right now and turn on notifications. We do not give you a headline and move on. We stay until there is an answer. Hit subscribe. Now, let us get into it. Her name is Nancy Long Guthrie. She was born on January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky. She moved to Tucson, Arizona in the 1970s, and she never left. Not because she had to stay, because she chose to. She loved the desert air. She loved the quiet pace of Southwest mornings, the way the light comes up over the mountains, and the city is still for just a moment before the day begins. She had a garden. Javelinas would come and eat her plants, and she laughed about it. Months before she disappeared, she laughed about it on camera, at a table in her favorite restaurant, talking to her daughter. She was a woman of deep faith, a mother who anchored her family without anyone needing to say it out loud. Her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, is one of the most recognized television anchors in America, a co-host of the Today Show on NBC for over a decade. Millions of people know Savannah. Very few knew her mother. That is exactly the kind of life Nancy had built for herself in Tucson. Present, loved, and quietly private. The night before she disappeared, she had been to a family dinner, a Saturday evening, ordinary and warm, the kind of night that feels like nothing at all when you're inside it. She returned home by private car to her house in the Catalina foothills, a peaceful and exclusive neighborhood on the northeastern edge of Tucson. She went inside. And sometime in the early morning hours of February 1st, 2026, someone came for her. The doorbell camera had already been removed before that night. There was blood on the front step, and the evidence that investigators found at that scene told a story so deliberate, so methodical, that it forced a question which changes everything about this case. Who does something like this, and how long had they been preparing for it? Think about what it takes to plan something like this. Not the motivation, not the target selection, just the logistics, the sheer number of decisions that had to be made correctly in advance for this operation to go the way it did. The backpack the suspect carried that night was not grabbed impulsively. It was purchased in advance, deliberately, as part of the preparation. The chest holster was not improvised. It was custom fitted for this operation. The flashlight was not clipped to a belt or held loosely in one hand. It was held between the teeth, the way a person holds a light when they need both hands completely free in total darkness, and they have practiced doing exactly that. A two-way radio was on scene. Not a phone, a radio, the kind of device you bring when you need real-time communication with someone who may not appear on any recovered footage. The doorbell camera was physically removed before the night of the crime, not during it, before it. That means the suspect had been to this property, had located the camera, had decided it needed to come down, and had returned on a separate occasion to remove it. That is not improvisation. That is scheduling. And then there is the covering. Face completely hidden, hair completely concealed, neck wrapped, hands inside tactical gloves. Every part of the body that might carry an identifier covered. This was not someone who grabbed a ski mask on the way out the door. This was someone who had studied what investigators look for in surveillance footage, who had worked backward from that knowledge, and who had designed their appearance for the purpose of defeating identification. Almost their entire appearance. Because coverage that complete, that deliberate, that patient does not happen without prior visits to the property, plural visits, without walking the approach, without studying the camera angles, without knowing which direction to face and which direction to avoid. That kind of preparation does not happen in a week. It does not happen in 2 weeks. It happens over time, in layers, with each visit building on the last. The FBI assessment of this operation is precise. This was not a crime of impulse. This was a rehearsal, a staged, timed, executed rehearsal. When you hear that word, rehearsal, what it means in an investigative context is that whoever did this had run through the scenario mentally more than once. They had identified the variables. They had solved for the problems. They had made the decisions that needed to be made before the night arrived so that on the night itself, nothing would require a new decision. On the morning of February 1st, 2026, they executed a plan that was already complete. The only question that has ever mattered is this: where did the plan begin? Because a person who stages a crime with this level of preparation does not start planning it a few weeks out. They start the moment they select a target. And the FBI now believes they know when that moment was and exactly where it happened. If October 17 is where the plan began, then what followed was a process of patience, of getting closer, slowly, without drawing attention, of narrowing the distance between observation and action until the moment felt exactly right. The FBI has been focused on 3 specific dates in the weeks before February 1, each one a weekend, and the pattern they formed together may tell us something important about who this person is. The first is January 11th, 2026, a Sunday evening. In the days and weeks after the abduction, FBI agents went door to door through the neighborhood surrounding Nancy Guthrie home. They knocked on the doors of the families who lived closest to her, and they asked a question that was very specific. Did you see anything unusual on the evening of January 11th? Do you have any camera footage from January 11th that you have not yet shared with investigators? Not January 31, not the week of the crime. January 11th, 3 weeks before Nancy Guthrie was taken. Here is why that date matters. Among the photographs released publicly by investigators, there are images recovered from the Google Nest doorbell camera at Nancy Guthrie home before the device was physically removed. Multiple major networks, including ABC, NBC, Fox, and News Nation, have independently reported from their own sources that those photographs were not taken on the same night. One image shows the suspect with a backpack. One image shows the suspect without a backpack. Different equipment, different visits, different purposes. One of those visits appears to have been a reconnaissance. The other was the crime itself. If one of those images was captured on January 11th, then the suspect was standing at the front door of Nancy Guthrie home 3 weeks before he took her. He had identified the property. He had located the camera. He had learned the layout. He was building the knowledge he would need. The second date is January 24th, 2026, a Saturday. The Saturday immediately before the week Nancy disappeared. Neighbors reported to investigators covering this case that FBI agents came to their doors and specifically asked about January 24, another weekend, another data point in a pattern that is becoming harder to ignore. And then there is the third date, January 31 into February 1, the night itself. Nancy had been at a family dinner on Saturday evening. She returned home by rideshare. Uber footage from January 31 is now in FBI hands. In the early morning hours of Sunday, February 1, 2026, the operation was executed. October 17, a Friday. January 11th, a Sunday. January 24th, a Saturday. February 1, a Sunday morning. Every single date the investigators are actively examining is a weekend, not a weekday, not a Wednesday afternoon or a Thursday evening, a weekend every time. Is this a person whose weekdays are accounted for? Someone with a job, a schedule, a routine that tracks their movements Monday through Friday. Someone who can only operate freely on the days when no one is watching them closely enough to notice they are gone. That is not a conclusion, but it is a question worth carrying forward because it narrows the portrait. What the timeline tells us is a story of patience, months of it. A restaurant in October where a target was observed, a front door in January where a house was studied, a crime in February that was executed the way something gets executed only after it has been fully rehearsed. This is not a person who acted on a sudden impulse. This is a person who waited and watched and moved only when everything was exactly as they had planned. If you've been watching with us and this case matters to you, subscribe to Notebook V right now if you have not already. Leave your theory in the comments below and stay with me because what comes next is the moment the investigation may finally start closing on a name. He covered his face, he covered his hair, he covered his neck. He wore tactical gloves to hide his hands. He knew the exact location of every camera at the property, and he removed the most critical one before the night of the crime. He held a flashlight between his teeth. He wore a chest holster. He carried a two-way radio. He had stood at this property before. He had studied it, and then he reached up in the dark to block a remaining lens with his gloved hand. Certain he had thought of every possible detail, and he left exposed a strip of skin on his right wrist, measuring approximately 2.5 centimeters, a gap between the lower edge of his sleeve and the upper edge of his tactical glove. That is the mistake. Not a dropped piece of equipment, not a discarded receipt, Not a face caught on a gas station camera 3 blocks away. A 2.5 centimeter strip of skin. For someone who had approached every other element of this operation with the precision of a person who had been planning for months, it is an almost unbelievable oversight. But it is there, and the FBI found it. Analysts reviewing the recovered footage identified something within that exposed patch of skin. There is a marking visible on the inner right wrist of the suspect, something that appears to be a tattoo, a specific design, in a specific location, on a specific part of the body. A retired FBI profiling analyst with 30 years of experience dedicated specifically to tattoo identification reviewed the footage. He spoke to national media and delivered a direct assessment. That small fragment of exposed skin, he said, could be the key to everything. There is a strong belief within the investigatory community that this suspect carries a distinctive tattoo on the inner right wrist, and that tattoo is currently being cross-referenced against federal criminal databases in real time. The forensic significance of a tattoo in an investigation like this cannot be overstated. Tattoos are permanent. They do not change. They cannot be altered quickly enough to matter once investigators know what to look for. They are often unique in their design or placement. A specific image in a specific location on a specific part of the body can narrow a suspect pool from thousands of people to dozens, in some cases, to one. And beyond uniqueness, tattoos carry cultural and organizational information. The style of ink, the imagery, the placement can point directly to a subculture, a gang affiliation, a military unit, a specific community that a person belongs to. They can tell investigators not just who the person might be, but what world they move through, who their associates are, what records might already exist under their name. The inner right wrist is not a hidden location. It is personal. It is visible. It is the kind of placement a person chooses deliberately because the design means something to them, because they want to see it when they look down. A person with a tattoo on their inner right wrist knows it is there. They know it is visible. When they are pulling on a tactical glove in the dark, that knowledge is present, and somehow, in the planning of everything else, it was not accounted for. The tattoo is not the only potential breach. The footage also reveals the suspect's eyes, their eyebrows, the line of their lashes, the faint edge of what appears to be facial hair near the upper lip. That is biological surface area from which trace material can transfer. The FBI conducted extensive evidence collection at Nancy Guthrie home in the days following the crime. If any of that material belongs to the suspect, and if genealogical DNA testing can produce a match, the tattoo becomes one thread in a net that is already being built from multiple directions at once. He planned for everything. Truly he did, except for a centimeter of skin. And in a case driven by precision and patience, 1 centimeter is exactly enough.
The Guthrie family had been quiet for weeks. No public statements, no new social media from Savannah. The silence stretched long enough that people started to wonder whether the family had pulled back entirely, whether they had been advised to stop speaking, whether they had simply reached a point where there was nothing left to say while the investigation continued around them in the dark. Then the statement came. It is signed by the entire family, Cameron and Christine, Annie and Tommaso, Savannah and Michael. It opens with gratitude for the people of Tucson who have stood by them. And then, very carefully, it begins to say things this family has never said publicly before. The first thing that stands out is a sentence about geography. The family writes that they believe it is Tucsonans and the greater Southern Arizona community that hold the key to finding resolution in this case. That is not an abstract gesture. That is the family, in a document almost certainly reviewed and at least partially shaped by investigators, saying directly what law enforcement has believed for weeks.
Whoever did this is local, from Tucson, possibly from that very neighborhood, possibly someone whose name is already known to people who are watching right now and simply have not yet made the call. The second thing is the date. The family asks the public to search their memories around the key timelines of January 31 and the early morning hours of February 1, and then adds, as well as the late evening of January 11th. That is the first time the Guthrie family has ever publicly named January 11th. Not neighbors, not journalists reporting from sources. The family, in a statement that was not written casually. If January 11th appears in that document, it is because investigators put it there. It is a deliberate signal to anyone who saw something that night and has not yet come forward. And then there is the last line that matters. The family writes that they want to celebrate Nancy Guthrie, her beautiful and courageous life, but that they cannot do that until she is brought to a final place of rest. Final place of rest. Not until she comes home, not until she is found safe, until she is brought to a final place of rest. That phrase does not come from a family that still believes their mother is alive somewhere, waiting to be found. That phrase comes from a family that is grieving while still refusing to stop looking. It is one of the most quietly devastating lines in this entire story, and most people who read that statement moved past it without stopping. Sheriff Chris Nanos of Pima County gave an interview to KVIA1030.com, a local radio station in Tucson, in a setting informal enough that his guard came down in ways it had not in previous national appearances. What came out in that conversation was a more honest picture of where things stand. He said the case is not cold. He said it directly, not even close. He said he believes it will be solved, either through DNA results coming in from one of multiple labs the investigation is working with across the country, or through some other break that makes the picture suddenly clear. He said his team is active, still working, still waiting on forensic results from digital video analysis. He also compared the case to Isabel Solis. Isabel Solis was a 6-year-old girl taken from her bedroom in Tucson in 2012. Her body was recovered years later in a remote desert location. It took nearly a decade to convict her killer. The sheriff did not make that comparison by accident. He is telling anyone paying attention that cases of this nature take time, that patience is part of the process, that no arrest today does not mean no arrest ever. He also said, when asked whether the person responsible could strike again, the word absolutely, not probably, not it is possible, absolutely. He walked it back into standard public safety language shortly after, but the word itself was already there. People in that neighborhood heard it. They are still living with it. Before we close, thank you to everyone watching Notebook V, to everyone who has stayed with this story from the beginning, to everyone who has shared these videos and kept the conversation alive. Your attention to this case matters. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with someone who has been following along. Subscribe if you have not already, and leave a candle in the comments for Nancy. She deserves to be found. Here is where this investigation stands right now. Genealogical DNA testing on material recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie home is ongoing. Federal requests for Walmart purchase records on the backpack and chest holster remain active. Uber footage from the night of January 31 is in FBI hands. The Google Nest camera images are under continued technical analysis, and a tattoo on the inner right wrist of the suspect is being cross-referenced against federal criminal databases as you watch this. A restaurant in October, a neighborhood in January, a front door in February, and a strip of skin less than an inch wide that a man who planned everything forgot to cover. Nancy Long Guthrie was born on January 27, 1942. She moved to Tucson in the 1970s and never left because she did not want to leave. She sat at her favorite table in her favorite restaurant and talked to her daughter on camera about what makes a place feel like home. She did not know who was watching. Nobody did. The FBI is not finished. This investigation is not narrowing toward nothing. It is narrowing toward someone. And when that moment comes, Notebook V will be here.